Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Welcome to Nightlight, everyone. Happy birthday, Tracy. It's nice to be live again. Barbara did not suspend me, according to rumor, for the proposed Greek culinary arts show that I've wanted to do. Sure, there are a few listeners right now saying, "Oh, I want to learn how to make baklava." But actually over the last 3 weeks, I had two last-minute cancellations, and Barbara sat in the dark for about a week after those devastating tornadoes came out of the Gulf Coast. And I hope our listeners from that region are doing well. We have a super special return guest tonight. Kathleen Marden is a top ufologist, impressive conference presenter, which is where I met her at the Pittsburgh MUFON conference in 2013. Ancient Aliens commentator and captivating author. Her website is KathleenMarden.com, and there's a hyphen between Kathleen and Marden. I'm sure the vast majority of listeners know Betty Hill was her aunt, so I don't think we need to go extensively into that right now. Kathleen recently revised and expanded on her groundbreaking capture, which she co-authored with Stanton Friedman in conjunction with the 60th anniversary of Betty and Barney's September 1961 abduction. Hi, Kathleen. How are you?
Hello. I'm doing well. Nice to be with you again.
Yeah. We are so glad you're here. And you and Stanton have a magnificent book, and I highly recommend the 60th anniversary of Capture to be in our listeners' libraries. I really enjoyed reading it.
And we're not going to tell the listeners, but I've updated the book. There's new information, scientific information that I have collected over the past 14 years, and some very exciting findings. So we're not going to talk about it, but it's there. And I also did a little chapter on Stanton.
All right. Okay. So we have an hour and 56 minutes to squeeze a whole bunch of stuff in this discussion. So, let's try to maximize our time. And if we don't get it all squeezed in, you're always welcome to come back. But
well, thank you.
In Captured, you are writing about family. It's also a case study, biography. There's a little bit of an autobiography. You're a character in your own book as well. you, even though you're writing about family, you do not portray Betty and Barney as infallible or idealized. You are objective, which makes it a more believable and truthful presentation of what happened. You give us several examples of, you say you're playing the devil's advocate. We cannot directly link trauma to Betty's dreams. At the outset, abduction, you do say Betty omitted some information like the star falling upwards, and fact fiction and flying saucers. There was a later sky watching expedition where there was a malfunctioning camera. So you have several examples of they're just normal. You are portraying family as just normal people. What I think it really makes for a contributing factor to an excellent book. Is that all deliberate? I think you seem like you're a very objective person when you're doing this research.
I am absolutely. I don't sugarcoat anything. I don't talk in a biased way, and that includes with my family. I would not be where I am if I didn't tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And Stanton would never have cooperated with me in this book if I wasn't scientific and unbiased. Those are the two requirements he had for me. He came to my house in Stratham, New Hampshire. That's where I lived at the time. I'm in Florida now. But he drove down from New Brunswick, and we spent a few days going through all of my files, all of Betty's files, and the manuscript that I had written. Had been slowly writing for many years. I investigated that case for 14 years before I asked Stanton if he'd like to join me. And Stanton said to me at the end, I will work with you because you are being scientific and you are being unbiased. So that's just the way I am. My background is in social science. I've taken hard science too, like physics and chemistry and those kinds of things, and also the philosophy of science, which is a little lighter, I think. But science is important to me, and being unbiased is important. I mean, science can be biased. I see that quite often.
Yeah, all the books of yours that I've read, and the two you co-authored with Stanton, there's a high standard of expectations that you place on each other as well as yourselves. Let's look at just give us a brief rundown of the trip that Betty and Barney took that led to the famous abduction case.
I'd be happy to. Okay. In fact, I can give you some new information that you might not be aware of.
Okay.
I was 13 years old, and I had been with June and Uncle Alex and my cousin. And I loved that trip. I took photographs, and I was showing those photographs to Betty and Barney and talking about what a great time I had. And Barney asked Betty if she had ever been to Niagara Falls. And she said no, she had not. So he decided to surprise her with that trip. So in a sense, I feel like I'm responsible in a way for what ended up happening toward the end of the trip, because I don't think they would have taken it if it hadn't been for me showing my photographs and talking about how much I loved it. So Barney decided to surprise Betty. She had a week off from her job as a social worker for the state of New Hampshire. She worked in child welfare and adoption. Barney worked for the U.S. Post Office, and so he asked for some time off from work too, and they took this trip. They had a wonderful time in Niagara Falls. They loved the Canadian side of the falls, and spent the night over there, and then decided to drive on toward Montreal. So they went to Toronto and spent the night 112 miles west of Montreal, and slept very well, had a big breakfast, went to Montreal for the day and had a great time as tourists riding around and seeing the sights. They had intended to spend the night in Montreal, but they had their dog with them, and they couldn't stay at the downtown hotels with their dog. So they were looking for a motel on the outskirts, and all the signs were in French, and they couldn't read French. And Barney was lost. He's on doesn't know which way to go, but there is the road that takes him home to New Hampshire. So he and Betty decided just to extend their trip and remain tourists through Quebec, and then entered New Hampshire at about 9:30 at night is when they stopped to have a cup of coffee and a little snack in Colebrook in the northern part of New Hampshire. And then they headed south, and they had checked their watches before they left that restaurant in Colebrook. It was 10:05, and they rewound the watches to make sure they were working when they arrived home, and started driving south. They weren't tired. It was a bright, light night, and they were just driving along enjoying themselves when about an hour south of Colebrook, they passed through the town of Lancaster, and just south of Lancaster, Betty spotted a new light in the sky. And what attracted her attention was, instead of moving in an arc like a falling star, it moved upward. And so she continued to watch it as it grew closer and closer, brighter and brighter. It was a bright light night, and the moon was about 3/4 full, maybe a little more. And they were just having a great time driving, and as this light came in closer, and Betty said to Barney, finally, "Barney, stop the car." She wanted to look at that light through the binoculars, but he didn't want to stop. And so she said, well, Delcy, our dog, that was Delcy, their dachshund, needed to be walked. So Barney found a spot just south of Twin Mountain at the Mount Cleveland picnic area, stopped the car. Betty got out with the binoculars, and she's looking at the star. Well, Barney decides to go to the trunk of the car and take the gun out and to walk the dog, because it's a picnic area and it's a wooded area. There are bears in that area. And so he thought that if a bear came out of the woods, he'd shoot the gun into the air, and the bear would run away. So that was his plan. And he did not believe in what they then called flying saucers. He thought that was nonsense. And so he walked the dog. Betty said to him, "You have to look at this, Barney. This is something perplexing." And so he looked, and he got back into the car and said, "Oh, Betty, just forget about it. It's just a Piper Cub or a commercial plane or something. It's nothing." Although he knew at that time it really was something. He was denying this to Betty because he enjoyed kind of teasing her and giving her a hard time. He'd often said, "Betty, don't be ridiculous." I heard that from his mouth a lot of times. So they're heading south again, and this craft is just following beside them. And they enter Franconia Notch, and that's a beautiful area of New Hampshire. At that time, Route 3 went through Franconia Notch. Now there's a larger interstate highway, 93, that goes through. But they're on Route 3. They come into the north section of Franconia Notch, and there directly ahead of them is Cannon Mountain. And now this craft is up over the top of the mountain. There's a lighted building at the top. There's a little ski lodge there. And the light blinks out as the craft passes overhead, meaning that perhaps there is a powerful electromagnetic field that's interfering with the electricity in the building. And so they continued driving on until they stopped at the Old Man of the Mountain that is just south of Cannon Mountain, to get another look at this craft, because it had come around the mountain and was now stopped beside the old man's profile. The old man's profile was 48 feet from forehead to chin, and they could see that craft was at least 1.5 times, maybe 2 times the length of the old man's profile, and it appeared to be rotating. And they could see that it was lighted on one side, and it was moving erratically. It would move in a vertical direction. It would make a zigzagging kind of motion. It was completely silent. So it was very perplexing. But Barney wanted just to get into the car and head south. So they did, and next they exited Franconia Notch, and this was the part of Lincoln, New Hampshire, North Lincoln, where the cabins were and the tourist attractions. And so as they drove through North Lincoln, Betty was saying to Barney, "You have to stop again, Barney. You have to stop. This craft is coming in really close." And so Barney was looking for a place to pull over when the craft swooped down over the highway, just on the side that Barney was driving on, causing him to have to stop in the middle of the road so he wouldn't be directly under the craft. And you know what happens to people who drive under craft. They usually end up on another section of road a couple of hours later. So I've investigated several cases where people tried to drive under it quickly. It didn't work. So anyway, Barney stopped the car, left the motor running, got out, looked up at this craft, and he now described it as appearing to be like a giant pancake. He could see the bright lights on the forward edge. And when he stepped away from the car, the craft moved to an adjacent field. It went from 200 feet above him to now about 100 feet above him and about 50 feet away. So he's looking through the binoculars, and he sees figures dressed in black, shiny uniforms looking down at him. This is all part of their conscious recall so far. Everything I've stated is conscious recall, including these figures. Betty wrote about them, and Barney, on the letter that they later sent to the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, only 6 days later. So this did not come out through hypnosis for the first time. And so Barney walked into the field. Betty remained in the car, putting the binoculars to his eyes and then pulling them down, shaking his head. "This can't be real. This can't be real," but it is. It's there, silent and hovering. And all of a sudden, he sees all but one of these figures who were at the window have now turned and walked to a panel. And he could see their arms go up. At this point, he could see from the tops of their heads down to about their knees. And when their arms went up, little red lights started to extend out of that craft on kind of a little fin-like structure. And something started to drop down out of the bottom of the craft. We know today what that is. That is that carrier beam that takes humans onto the craft. But Barney thought, well, maybe it was a rope, but then he said, no, it wasn't a rope. He didn't know what it was, but he did get the distinct impression that there was a plan for him, and that plan was to capture him like, quote, a bug in a net. And he didn't want that to happen, so he went running as fast as he could back to the car. And when he entered the car, he saw that the craft was headed back in his direction. So he put the car into gear and he went speeding down Route 3, hoping he could find a police officer. But he told Betty to roll down the window and look up. She thought she'd see lights, but all she saw was blackness. It was the underside of the craft. And then she and Barney heard a series of code-like buzzing sounds striking the trunk of the vehicle. When that happened, a tingling sensation passed through their bodies. The car vibrated. And then, as if only a moment had passed, they found themselves 35 miles down the highway. They had some memory of observing a huge fiery orb that seemed to be sitting on the ground, of a roadblock, and of a dirt road with tall trees all around. And then they heard a second series of buzzing sounds, and they started talking again. Betty said to Barney, "Now do you believe in flying saucers?" And she thought he was kidding when he said, "Betty, don't be ridiculous. There's no such thing." He knew what had happened. But he said to Betty, "Let me prove I can make that sound with this car." So he stopped the car. He drove it from one side of the road to the other. He did everything he could to create that buzzing sound, and he couldn't. So the two of them rode on down the road to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, expecting it to be sometime between 2 and 3 in the morning when they arrived, but it was actually about 5:15 in the morning. I think the reason I know that is because I have Betty's watch, and that watch says 5:15, and when neither watch was running when they went into their house. So they set their watches for the time that they arrived and wound them, and they never ran again.
Interesting. So and there's a plaque at the site where the abduction happened?
Yes, the state of New Hampshire has erected a historical marker. They did it on the 50th anniversary of Betty's and Barney's UFO encounter. And so I'm very proud of that. I worked with the state on that. A man named Mike Stevens from New Hampshire came up with the idea and contacted me and had people sign a petition for the state. And then I had to send them a couple of dozen, I think it was, reports and articles and things like that to prove to them that it really did take place. And I wrote some a sample writing that would go on the sign. They changed that a little bit. But, yeah, so I was really pleased when that happened.
Interesting. Okay, so they get home at 5:15. Let's fast forward a little bit. And how did their lives as social workers and working at the post office begin to change? Barney really didn't want to go public with
neither Betty nor Barney wanted to go public with this story. Walter Webb from NICAP, who was an astronomer, did an investigation. It was confidential. They were never going to tell anybody about this. They could lose their jobs. They could lose their reputations if they allowed themselves to be portrayed as a couple of kooks who believed they were abducted by aliens. So anyway, it did have a profound effect on Barney. And I think that happened because Betty was incredibly curious. She wanted to know more about UFOs, more about what happened. She went to the library and took out the first book she had ever read on that topic. And then when they came down to my childhood home, I grew up across the street from my grandparents, who were Betty's parents, and Betty could not stop talking about that experience. And they would make weekend trips sometimes up to the White Mountains to look for that dirt road with the tall trees all around. And Barney did not want Betty talking about it. He said to her when they arrived home, "Betty, don't ever tell anyone about what happened to us. No good can ever come of it." But she couldn't leave it alone. And I think that contributed to Barney's post-traumatic stress disorder. Betty was not as impacted as Barney. She had a series of 5 dreams that happened 10 nights after the experience. And those dreams had information for which she had conscious recall, but sandwiched in between those dreams was an abduction by what looked like humans with black hair and blue cadet uniforms and cadet hats. And so, for years I searched for information about that kind of hypnopompic dream that you have just before you wake up in the morning. And that's when she had hers. And what I discovered just recently is that it is possible to have a dream about events that actually did occur, but then to add fantasy material to it as you're working through anxiety that you're having over something. And so that appears to be what happened, because those ETs were not the ones that Betty and Barney saw under hypnosis. The ones under hypnosis were gray-skinned and had large eyes and were completely hairless and no external ear, just a small nose and a slit for a mouth and spindly arms and legs and kind of a barrel chest. That's what they remembered. Yeah, go ahead.
And they had normal hands?
Neither Betty or Barney could remember precisely what their hands were like, if they had 3, 4, or 5 fingers, but they just didn't remember that part of it. And so, it's hard, especially if you're not focusing on their hands. And Betty kept her eyes closed a lot when she was on the craft, and so did Barney. There was a little one who was looking in through the doorway at Betty, and he frightened her terribly. So she was keeping her eyes closed because she just didn't want to look at him. And so a lot of what she said was through sensation. And Barney's, the impact that this had on Barney was that he developed post-traumatic stress disorder, conversion hysteria. He ended up having bleeding ulcers and high blood pressure. He wasn't able to sleep well. He ended up in the hospital. He had to take a 3-month leave of absence from work because this experience in New Hampshire's White Mountains had induced, psychogenically induced, this physiological condition that caused him to become disabled. And so this is why he was referred to Dr. Benjamin Simon. And Dr. Simon was renowned in his field as a psychiatrist because he had developed a special technique using deep hypnosis where he could get to the crux of the matter. So, maybe it wasn't just that UFO experience that caused so much trauma in Barney. Maybe it was something else that happened in his life too. And so you have to look at all of that because Barney was much more impacted. But I think that part of that was that Barney had conscious recall of observing those non-humans looking down at him, that he felt that he was going to be captured, that he realized there was missing time, and that the tops of his shoes were so deeply scraped, he had to buy new shoes. And, that he knew that something had happened, and it really bothered him greatly, especially being a black man married to a white woman in 1960, 1961. Barney had grown up under segregation. He spent a lot of his childhood in Virginia and in rural areas of Virginia. And it was tough for any person of color in that time frame to grow up under segregation. And Barney was very smart. His IQ was 140. He had wanted to go to college, but he was denied that opportunity because of the color of his skin. And so that's why he went into the Army before World War II, because that was the only opportunity, really, for him at that time.
Do you think that this abduction had anything to do with race? Is there any evidence of that?
No, I don't think so. There's no evidence that it was for race at all. This is speculation, and I don't do a lot of speculating. But in the scientific studies that I've worked on, the social science studies, we have discovered that about 60% of abductees know that a family member has also been abducted, and that this is intergenerational, that there appears to be a long-term genetic study taking place over time. And I have reason to believe that it wasn't Betty's first time, but it was the first time that she remembered it. I mean, I could be completely wrong on that as well, but I do know that my own mother was also abducted, and that that was kept confidential, fortunately for her.
Yeah, and you had that mentioned. Your mom was abducted, and you also have more information in your abduction files book, and we can talk about that later. But that's so. If there was a family history on your mom's side of abductions, like Barney was just kind of, if we just go with that scenario, Barney was just kind of like an innocent bystander who got pulled into the situation through just by being there, right place at the wrong time type thing.
That's a possibility, yes.
Okay. Okay. And so, and there's the Barney realized there's like some kind of cup thing placed around the lower regions, and when he's taking a shower, that would be distressing. So all these unusual events lead them to Dr. Simon, and in preparation for Captured, you actually listened to many hours of the tapes. They still exist?
Yes, I have a full copy of them that Betty gave to me. She knew I was writing this book before she passed away. And so not only did I listen to them time and time again, but I transcribed all of them as well. And I wasn't a good typist, so it took me a while. But I did find that what actually happened was not the same as what was written in the first book about Betty and Barney. There were several discrepancies, and I ended up going to John Fuller's archival collection at Boston University, and I was with Stanton when we did that, and we found a letter that John's publisher had written, saying, if you want this to be a book, you're going to have to spice it up a little bit. You're going to have to add some tension here and there. And so John wrote this not according to what the abduction tapes had on them, but for this publisher. He was a professional writer. He wasn't a researcher. He wasn't an investigator like Stanton and I were. So he did have a best-selling book. People loved it, but it was not entirely accurate. Even the statements that Betty and Barney made under hypnosis were not entirely accurate.
Okay, let's... There's a lot of information in this book about what they told you, told other people, newspaper people, early, just not long after it happened.
Well, they didn't tell newspaper people. No.
Okay.
No, they talked to the military.
That's right. Okay, I'm sorry.
They talked to UFO investigators, scientists, and the family and close friends, and we were all sworn to secrecy.
Okay, and when they're under hypnosis, under Dr. Simon's care, can you explain what came out of the hypnosis sessions that confirmed what they were telling you, or there's a little difference?
Well, I did a comparative analysis of Betty's and Barney's statements. Beginning at the beginning of their trip, Dr. Simon hypnotized them separately and reinstated amnesia at the end of each session, so they couldn't share information. So it gave me something to work with. I did not put that comparative analysis, that boring part, the scientific part, into the book. I just talked about the discrepancies. And what I discovered is that under hypnosis, Betty and Barney were describing many things that were exactly the same, even the things that they had amnesia for. But under hypnosis, they were different from Betty's dreams. So her sometimes they even contradicted the information in Betty's dreams. So I thought that was extraordinarily interesting, and it added more credibility to the story because I knew that Betty had not, just told her dreams under hypnosis and had not convinced Barney that her dreams were reality and something that he repeated. under hypnosis. And so that's all captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO experience, and you'll see the difference. I'll give you just one little sample. In Betty's dreams, when the roadblock happened and the car stalled out, Betty and Barney were surrounded. Their car was surrounded. There were 8 to 11 men standing in the road, and they just surrounded the car. That didn't happen under hypnosis. Betty and Barney, separately from one another, said something different from the dream material. They said there were 6 people standing in the road, and they were not human. And Betty saw what was going on. They talked about this. Betty said, "What is that?" And Barney said, "It's the ones that I saw when I was standing in the field." Well, Betty became terrified and tried to run into the woods and hide, but she was intercepted. And Barney, feeling that he might be harmed if he fought back, just opened the door and put his foot on the ground. And then it was different than what Betty had dreamed. And we also know how Barney's shoes were scraped. That is that he was being supported. He felt as if he was floating, and only the toes of his shoes were bumping along the rocks. So in the book, it tells you everything regarding the evidence and how that evidence actually happened.
Okay, and you said they, page 83, they remained unshakable.
Yes. Dr. Simon attempted to convince them that Barney had absorbed Betty's dreams and she was only repeating her dreams. And being the skeptic that I am, I had to check that out. I had to do that comparative analysis. I was not ready to accept that it was a real abduction at that point. And I certainly, after doing as thorough an investigation as I could possibly do over a 14-year period, truly believe now that it did occur, and especially with all of the new evidence that's in the new book as well. But Dr. Simon tried to convince them that, they should forget about it and it was only a dream. But they remained unshakable. They went home. They tried to forget about it, but they knew. They had evidence. Dreams don't produce physical evidence. Dreams didn't make those shiny spots on the trunk of the car that were magnetic and that were not there the day before. So, a dream does not produce physical evidence.
And in your alien abduction files, you talk about, I'll turn the wrong page, searching behaviors, searching for an answer. And you use the example where Richard Dreyfuss is making the Devil's Tower shape out of the mashed potatoes. And you say on the weekends, back to Captured, Betty and Barney started retracing their route, just trying to figure out, like, what did we live through? Making this repeated journey to, I think you said jog your memory. You mentioned that earlier in the show. So there seems to be some, you're talking about physical evidence of Barney's shoes being that he was dragged. This kind of behavior does not seem like it's just going to start for absolutely no reason.
Right, and I don't think that he was dragged. I think that just the toes of his shoes were bumping along the rocks because they were down, but I think that they probably used some kind of device to lift him.
Okay.
Sort of, like Charlie Hickson and Calvin Parker, perhaps, that sort of thing. But, yeah, Betty and Barney made repeat trips up to the White Mountains, just searching for that area where they found the roadblock. And they couldn't find it until after their abductions, their hypnosis sessions were over, and they remembered. And so on Labor Day weekend of 1965, Betty and Barney, my grandparents, and my mother and I went on a camping trip up in that area. My father and brothers weren't with us. My father was a Boy Scout leader, and he took the Boy Scouts and my brothers camping elsewhere that weekend. But so we got into the car, all six of us, and we were just driving along, and all of a sudden Barney turned, and lo and behold, there was the road. And then he stopped, and there was the path through the woods. And they walked out there, and there was the clearing where the craft landed and the sand that they remembered walking on. So, yes, they finally found it. And Dr. Simon had said to them, if this really happened, you will find that spot, and then you'll know that it was real.
Okay, and that almost sounds like some of these stories you may have heard about 20 years ago, where soldiers going back to Utah and Omaha beaches. You see stories like that of Vietnam veterans going back to it. It just seems like they were confronting some very horrible or traumatic event by going to the place where that happened. And as we're reading those sections from Captured, I remember a section from Bessel van der Kolk's very highly regarded book, The Body Keeps a Score. And he was talking about the study done by 200 Harvard sophomores the study was begun about 1939 to 1944, and you get after the study started, there a lot of these college students are going to end up in the Pacific or European theaters, and they were interviewed about their war experiences in 1989 and 90. And he writes, 4.5 decades later, the majority gave very different accounts from the narratives recorded in their immediate post-war interviews. With the passage of time, events had been bleached of their intense horror. In contrast, those who had been traumatized and subsequently developed PTSD did not modify their accounts. Their memories were preserved essentially intact 45 years after the war ended.
Very interesting.
I think that this Dr. van der Kolk's book, which came out in somewhat recent book, I'm trying to find the title page, came out in 2014. His recent information seems to be very consistent from about 50 years prior to what Betty and Barney reported 50 years prior to the publication of The Body Keeps the Score. Mm-hmm. It just seems like a consistent pattern of this is how the human mind works, and maybe the more, in many cases, the more traumatic experience, the more clearly the mind remembers the details.
Yes, as long as you have that information, then you do. And I'll tell you that all these years later, I remember that day, that phone call to my mother, going up to Betty's and Barney's house and hearing that story from Betty for the first time while Barney was sitting pensively in a corner quietly talking with my father while he was waiting for a call back from Pease Air Force Base. So, it just stays there. When something is that startling or wells up that many emotions, you don't forget about it.
Mm-hmm. I think that the information that you and Stanton assembled for the original book and the revised book is just very convincing evidence. And there's one of the scenes that kind of sticks is one of the, maybe one of my favorite scenes is Betty wanted to take home a book. Mm-hmm. From and that seems very very normal. And she was mad when the main alien said, "No, you can't take that with you." And she was very insistent on having a souvenir. And if I were ever abducted, I want to take home something too.
Right, but those little guys have the job of, they work as guards and assistants, and they won't let you get off that craft with anything. And, and she called it a book because she didn't have the words for it, just like Native Americans used to look into the sky and see flying canoes because they had that word. They didn't have the word flying saucer or or any other word except for a flying canoe. That was transportation. So, that's what happened. And so when Betty was being escorted off the craft without that book that she so badly wanted, that it was more like a tablet. And she said to the leader, well, he said to her, I'm sorry that you were frightened. And she was. And even though the entities had reassured Betty and Barney over and over again that they would not be harmed, they only needed to do a few simple tests and they'd be on their way. And Betty had come to like the leader at that point because he had taken away some pain she experienced. And so as they were walking down the path, she said to him, well, do you think you could come back? Because I know people who would be interested in speaking with you, who are, have a lot more knowledge than I have, she said. And he said, well, maybe I can come back, but it's not my decision to make. And she said, well, if you come back, how will you find me? How on earth, out of all of the millions of people on this planet, would you find me? And he said to her, we can always find those that we want to find. So I'm thinking maybe she had an implant. And maybe that's how they found her that night.
Okay, that puts things into perspective. That's a good explanation. So there are other weird events that began happening afterward. Maybe that they were making the follow-ups like you just mentioned. There was the blue earrings found in a pile of leaves on the kitchen table. That's pretty going from weird to creepy type.
Yeah, the earrings she had been wearing that night and didn't realize that she didn't have suddenly appeared on their dining room table after in withered leaves, and it was on a day that they were away from home up in the White Mountains just searching for that dirt road, and sure enough they arrived home and saw those leaves, which was pretty creepy. They picked up the leaves to throw them out, and there were the earrings she had been wearing that night. So maybe the ETs returned her jewelry. I know of other cases where that happened as well, that they don't steal human jewelry. They seem to return it.
Okay, and a few minutes ago, you said that Betty contacted the Air Force Base, and not long after that, she began to notice that the phone was tapped.
Right. Well, yes, she...
I don't know if they were linked, but...
She contacted Pease Air Force Base because my father's best friend was at our house when one of the times Betty called, and he said that they had been instructed. He was had been the chief of police in the small town of Newton, New Hampshire, which is right next to Kingston, where I grew up, and he said that Pease Air Force Base had contacted the police department and told them to instruct anyone who had a UFO sighting to file a report with Pease. So being the good citizens that Betty and Barney were, they did file a report with Pease Air Force Base. And that's how they found out that there was also a radar return at 2:14 a.m. that night. And it would have been probably about 2:14 or a little just after that when Betty and Barney were released. So I don't know, maybe it was the craft they saw.
Okay, and around this time, they became befriended by Dr. James McDonald, and we know him from your fact fiction and flying saucers book, and he seemed like he was a good guy, a pretty good guy.
He was, and there were two James McDonalds. There was Dr. James McDonald, who was the meteorological physicist from the University of Arizona in Tucson. And then there was the James McDonald from Pease Air Force Base, who was supposedly a recently retired CIA agent. So, that arouses concern, too. I asked Betty about that, and she kind of scoffed at it and said, oh, he was a friend. Well, you can be friendly with CIA agents. They tend to be very friendly, in fact, and likable and talk a lot. And, Barney was playing paddleball with James McDonald quite a bit, Jim McDonald. So that raises questions. And he was present when Robert Holman and C.D. Jackson, who were a couple of scientists from IBM, went up to interview Betty and Barney in November of 1961. So, it raises a lot of questions without answers. It's impossible to answer it because that information would be probably classified above top secret, or at least top secret.
That's one of only a few unanswered questions in your book.
Mm-hmm.
I think you really do. You and Stanton, we're a team that, you are meticulous researchers and thorough authors, and I think there's almost, very little that you don't present every angle, and you have an answer for just about everything. Mm. One of the other bizarre instances in your book deals with the pink powder on Betty's dress. Mm-hmm. And the splotches, the splotches on the car that weren't there. Those were some pretty unusual events in themselves, along with the leaves and earrings.
And some pretty compelling physical evidence as well.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about the pink powder?
I can talk a little bit about that.
Okay.
Betty's dress has undergone scientific analysis probably about 10 times now. There has been new scientific analysis that is in the new section in the book, the updated portion of the book that I'm not going to talk about, but I will talk about Betty's dress. And when she arrived home, she realized that the lining of her dress was torn from waist to hemline. The hem was torn down on one side. There was 1.5 inch tear in the stitching at the top of her zipper. On the other side, there was the thick zipper fabric was actually torn. So many questions, and she put it into her closet knowing that it had to be repaired, but the next time she took it out, it was covered with a pink powdery substance. So she took it out and hung it on the clothesline. The powder blew away, but she didn't throw it away. She decided that she would keep it just in case it might hold some evidence on what happened that night. So the first place that it went to for analysis, it wasn't until the 70s, really. and that was the University of Cincinnati's chemistry department. And they did all kinds of testing on it and thought that it was unusual. Now, Phyllis Budinger was the other one who did some thorough scientific testing. She worked for BP Amoco Oil Company, formerly Standard Oil, and she worked there for 35 years. She's an analytical chemist who attempts to identify chemicals that can't be identified or are mysterious. So she did a very thorough analysis on Betty's dress. And so far, the scientists believe that there might be some kind of yeast or fungus that was deposited on that dress when it was dropped to the floor, when the examiner broke Betty's zipper trying to unzip her dress. She had to help him. Then the dress fell to the floor, and that lower part of the dress that fell onto the floor was saturated in this pink powder. There's another area of the dress that was saturated too, and that is around the upper parts of her arms where they held her when they were escorting her. They just wrapped those long fingers around her arms. And so that was pretty consistent, the scientists said, with what Betty had stated, that it did come most likely from these entities' hands and then from the environment inside the craft. And one of the PhD scientists speculated that he thought that Betty's dress had been sterilized, that she had been sterilized in a way, and the dress fabric itself, which killed off the bacteria and viruses. But then when yeast from the floor and from the hands of the entities deposited onto her dress, it flourished and finally died. So he thinks that that is a good explanation for what actually occurred. That is not captured, I do not believe, at least in the old part, but something that I found very interesting. So, this speculation. There are some things in the new part of the book that is not speculative at all and is fascinating information. So I think that you're going to enjoy reading that and finding out what that is.
Okay. And the star map was very captivating.
Yes.
Might as well talk about how Marjorie Fish got involved in what star map means to understanding this abduction story.
Yes, well, when Betty was on the craft, she said to the leader, "I know you're not from around here. Where's your home port?" And he produced this three-dimensional star map that in her dream was like pulling down a 1961 classroom map, just like a window shade. But that's
right.
Not what she remembered under hypnosis. Under hypnosis, it was three-dimensional. And so she told Dr. Simon about that, and he said, "Well, Betty, if you can remember that map accurately, and it doesn't trouble you too much, go home and draw that map, draw what you saw." And she did. And it was published in the first book that was written about their case. And so Marjorie Fish, a brilliant woman from Ohio who was a school teacher at that time, but then later went on to become a research associate at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, saw that map in the book and thought that, since she was an amateur astronomer, that if this place was actually in our local galactic neighborhood, that maybe she would be able to find it. And at first she thought she'd have many matches, but she had to go to the university. She had to sit down and hand copy all the distance data and all of the characteristics of all of the stars in our local galactic neighborhood out 54 light years from the sun in all directions. And then she took that information home and she started to construct three-dimensional star map models using a frame and monofilament line and beads of different sizes, because we didn't have computers in those days. She spent a long time doing this, and imagine the math she had to do to put every one of those stars in its proper location in that three-dimensional model. I'm just amazed at her mind and what she did, but she was a genius. And so it took 4 years. She still had not found the star map in any of those models. But then a new catalog was produced, and the new Gliese star catalog. And she went back to the university. She found it. She copied the new distance data. By that time, she had built 14 of these models. One of them had 256 stars in its proper location. And then she took this new distance data back, and she rearranged stars so in compliance with the new distance data. And there were 3 stars that were not on the original work that Marjorie was doing, because our astronomers did not have an estimate of them being that close. They were unknown. So those 3 came into the map as well. And finally, she had a match for Betty's star map. And the 2 stars in the foreground are Zeta Reticuli 1 and 2, and the sun is on that map. There are solid lines connecting several of the stars. The 2 larger stars in the foreground have 5 lines connecting them, meaning that those are regular trade routes. And then there were 4 other stars that had lines connecting to them, 3 with 2 lines, 1 with 3 lines. So that indicated the number of times that they were trading, I suppose. Then there were dotted lines, meaning they were expeditions, and then those 3 did not have lines connecting to them. So that was a huge find. The only problem she had was who was going to vet her work. And that's how Stanton Friedman came into the scene. He was beginning to speak on UFOs. He was billing himself as a flying saucer physicist and speaking ecologist. And Coral Lorenzen, who is the co-director of APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, called Stanton and said, Stan, I have a lady in Ohio who is an amateur astronomer and has found a match for Betty Hill's star map. If you go to Ohio to speak, would you mind talking with her? And so finally he did go to Ohio to speak, and he interviewed Marjorie, and he said to me that Marjorie was a lot more comfortable talking to scientists than in talking to the general public, that she was brilliant. He really had a lot of respect for her. And because of that, he agreed to find scientists to vet her work. One of them was Dr. Alan Hynek, who you probably know was the astronomical consultant for Project Blue Book, who finally decided that instead of debunking UFOs like he was hired to do, realized that you couldn't debunk these, that you could spread disinformation, but there was really something scientifically to study. And then David Saunders was another one of the scientists. He was a statistician who had worked on the Condon Committee as one of their primary researchers. He was the one who found the famous trick letter, I should say infamous trick letter. And then the other one was the head of the astronomy department at Ohio State University. And he had, by this time, computers. Students did star map models. And sure enough, Betty's was the closest they could find. And Marjorie's work was perfect. So that was terrific. Stanton was the first to write about this, and it was carried to scientists. Terence Dickinson wrote about it in Astronomy Magazine, and then there was a glossy booklet that they published about this as well. Terence Dickinson, in looking at this, said that the very interesting thing is that all of these stars were in a plane, sort of like Stanton would say, pepperoni pizza, and with pepperonis all in a plane, rather than raisin bread with the raisins spread out through long distances. So these stars made sense, star to stars. And Terence Dickinson said that if we had lived on Zeta Reticuli 2 and we were exploring through space, this is the route that we would take and the stops that we would make. It was amazing that all of the stars on Betty's map ended up being sun-like stars, even though only 5% of the 1,000 stars in our local galactic neighborhood are sun-like. And all of the sun-like stars in that volume of space were on Betty's map. That was really outstanding, and it caused many scientists to believe that Betty and Barney had a real experience. But then it caused the disinformants to say that, oh, you could throw marbles into the air and have them land in a pile of sand and come up with the identification. Well, maybe you could find that configuration somewhere in space, but not having the special characteristics that Betty's map had.
And that it almost sounds like the Dogon people from
yes, in Africa.
1,000 years ago, who knew that there were Sirius 1 and 2 star. There were two separate stars.
Yes.
And they knew that before it was like Galileo invented the telescope or something like. And it was like,
yes,
you don't just come up with something like that and be so accurate.
Yes, absolutely. And it makes you wonder how long these non-human people have been around our planet.
Yeah, and speaking of the debunkers, you get some people writing their articles. I think there was one was attacking the buzzing sounds, and you and Stanton checked the latches. Barney thought Barney thought his gun was rattling around inside the trunk, and you mentioned that at the start of the show. But you went out and checked how the 57 Chevys were made. There was 2 latches under the hood and only one in the trunk.
Yes. Yeah, and it was Carl Flock who had come up with that theory to begin with. Now, Carl Flock was in the CIA from his college days and ended up being the Assistant Secretary of Defense under, I think it was Ronald Reagan. I'm not positive. But Carl believed that this actually happened, but thought that Betty and Barney were probably the only abductees that were ever visited on this planet. And as he was examining the evidence, and he was thorough in his work, he misunderstood something that Betty said about the lock on the trunk of the car. And Betty tried to tell him that, no, Carl, you're wrong. This is not what happened. But he wouldn't change his mind. I can't believe if these people who find out that they're wrong, instead of apologizing and go on and say, I was wrong, I apologize, let's look further, they are so bullheaded that they're going to defend it to the end. Instead of admitting that they've made a simple mistake. I don't understand people like that.
Okay, and you were talking about the trade routes drawn between the stars on the star map with the Mars rover, the photos being sent back over the last month or so. Mm-hmm. Is there any further evidence that would has come to light since these photos have been sent back to NASA? That just came to my mind. I don't know if it's too early yet or
not that I'm aware of. Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, it's an interesting, just fascinating project going on, and it looks like it's driving around through what's an empty lake bed, dried up lake beds. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just happen to wonder if anything like that started corresponding with the trade routes. Okay, just how does capture differ from Fuller's The Interrupted Journey?
Well, it differs in many ways because John's publisher made him fictionalize part of that book. And in Captured, I time and time again say that this is different from John Fuller's book. But, the sequence is different. The details about the stops are different. The Betty's and Barney's statements are different. They might have made part of that statement, but John rewrote it so that it was more maybe articulate or I don't know, in the way a professional writer did. And he wrote a good book. I have to say it was a very good book. I enjoyed reading it. I thought he did a great job, but he was under a tremendous amount of pressure, not only from his publisher, but also from Dr. Simon, because Dr. Simon him pretty viciously, even attacking his writing style. And Dr. Simon was not happy with John Fuller. So I'm amazed that the book was even published because of all of the challenges that John faced.
Okay, and as the years passed, it was the Betty and Barney and you really had what do you say really big honor by attending President Johnson's inauguration.
Yes,
And Barney's awards for his humanitarian work.
yes, absolutely, and it was just wonderful. And another reason why Betty and Barney wanted their story to remain confidential. Barney, in 1965, was appointed to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights as a state advisory member for the state of New Hampshire. He had been given an award from Sergeant Shriver and the governor of New Hampshire for the good work he did through the poverty program. He and Betty worked on literacy programs in the state of New Hampshire because in those days you had to be able to read in order to vote, and you had to pass a literacy test. So they did a lot of work and campaign work too, and they were such a great role models for me growing up, doing all these wonderful things for other people, doing the right thing. And so I was emulating them, and I ended up receiving an invitation to go to the inauguration as well, and went with Betty and Barney. It was fantastic. Probably, stands out as being the best experience of my entire life. I just loved it. The balls, wearing the gowns, the dinners, meeting all of the top politicians, and fantastic time.
Hopefully, being a guest on Nightlight will be part, the second most memorable moment of your life.
We'll see.
Okay, so when we look at the information that you prevent or presenting from an event in 1961, and you're friends with Travis Walton, and talking with him on the phone at conferences. Travis had his abduction experience in the 70s. Is that right?
Yes. Yes, he did.
Okay, and then in the alien abduction files, Denise had her experience.
1981 was the one that was like Betty and Barney.
Okay, that I was thinking she had more of like seemed like she had some lifelong abduction. I
Yes.
try not to do math anymore, and I have to. But so if we're looking at like 1961 to in the 70s and 80s, do we see any type of pattern emerging from all these people that with whom you are very close?
Well, I don't want to make it sound like Denise was a good friend of mine when I investigated her case, or that Travis was when I did my investigation too, because that would bias me. But experiencers have characteristics in common. I've worked on 3 major studies. The first one had 75 experiencers, and 25 of those were in a control group of non-experiencers, so that we could compare the difference between experiencers and the general population. And then I am a member of the Edgar Mitchell Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial and Extraordinary Encounters. And we did a huge study of 3,200 experiences before we wrote the book. And then we did 516 experiencers in a third study, and that was through the Mutual UFO Network with Dr. Don C. Donderi from McGill University, recently retired. And consistently, all of those studies have given us information about experiencers and how they're different from the general population, and answered a lot of the questions that we had. I told you earlier about finding that this out is intergenerational. Also, family members have 70% of the abductees have seen UFOs at 500 feet or less away from them, and their family members have as well. Experiencers over time become psychic or intuitive at a high rate, 65% of abductees. They become empaths. 95% of the abductees are empaths, and they weren't that way initially, we don't think, but something about their experience gave them this psychic sense where they can detect the health of another person's body or their emotions in a way that it's as if they feel it within their own body. And I think this is a brilliant plan, if it is a plan, by these non-human entities, because I know from all of these studies I've done that they're incredibly concerned about our use of nuclear weapons. They say that that other planets that had reached our stage of development have ended up destroying life on the planet. They've created an environmental collapse through nuclear war. And so the brilliant plan they have, I think, is to make people empathic. And I think that's part of this generational change that they are doing with human DNA. And, you know, you cannot harm another person if you feel their pain. So if this is intentional, it is brilliant. I think they need to work a little faster, though. Also, experiencers become more spiritual. 86% of the abductee group became more spiritual. 61% of the experiencers, 50% of the overall abductees have paranormal events in their homes. And so there were 2 paranormal events that are part and parcel of alien abduction and or just contact. And those are orbs, lighted orbs that seem to have intelligence inside a person's home. And the other is motion in the mattress. It's the feeling that you're lying on your bed at night and something is walking on the bed. So very high percentage, 75% for the abductees for mattress motion, 50% for orbs, 61% for the experiencer group overall. We asked, would you want this event to stop? If you could stop abductions today, would you want it? And 71% of the experiencers overall said, no, we don't want it to stop. But among the abductee group, which was identified by Dr. Donderi through testing, among the abductee group, it was 75% who did not want it to stop. So, we wanted to know why. They want more answers. The older they become, the more these ETs are beginning to communicate with them, give them information about why they're here and Earth history and that sort of thing. I recently was MUFON's director of experiencer research. We recently changed it to the Experiencer Resource Team. I've recently stepped down due to demands on my time. I just don't have time to do everything in the day. So I had to step down from the volunteer job. And but where was I taking this now?
You were talking about the renaming of the
team.
Experiencer
Resource Team.
Yeah, right,
Yeah.
right.
But we have 45 they're kind, caring individuals. And those kind, caring individuals are non-judgmental listeners for experiencers. That's something that I set up as their director of their team. And it grew over the 10 years when I was director. I'm very, very proud of that team and the people who are selflessly volunteering to help experiencers just by listening to their story or finding a list of hypnotherapists that maybe they want to enter into a private relationship with, or an online support group to help experiencers. So the way that people can get in touch with MUFON's Experiencer Resource Team is to go to MUFON.com and scroll down to Experiencer Resource Team and click on the link. The team will come up. I'm now a consultant on the team. And so you take the 30-question questionnaire, very simple, true and false. It's not part of the study that we've done on experiences at all. It's something just as an icebreaker to give the specialist on the team a little more information about the experience. And then that person will arrange to call you and be very kind and nice and listen to what happened to you and help you out if they can. So that was the intention that I wanted to set up when I did, because MUFON was getting a bad reputation because the people who were doing the investigations were doing a scientific investigation and looking for nuts and bolts evidence. And a lot of people went to MUFON looking for help, but all they ended up with was an interrogation and no help. So I wanted to provide that for experiencers of contact. So that's what we did.
In alien abduction files, you do cover that abductees frequently come away from the experience with a gift of healing, mainly for animals. One person, a tall, thin, non-human entity with large, faceted, insect-like eyes entered the room. The being positioned his face within inches of hers and stared into her eyes. At that instant, she felt the most intense sensation of pure love that she had ever known. With passages like that, and like the the healing for animals, it seems like you are dealing with a lot of empathic people that you mentioned just a few minutes ago.
Mm-hmm.
we could look at Barney's case, or it wasn't as positive as a couple other examples, but people really have changed significantly, if that's the right word. It became very empathic people, like you said.
Yes, and I think that we need to consider the fact that Betty and Barney were the first that we knew of, the first scientifically investigated case of alien abduction in the United States. Betty and Barney didn't know if they were going to be carried off to some distant planet. There was nothing established. But over the years, with all of the researchers, we have a much better grasp on what is going on, and there's some consistency across experiencers in what occurs on craft and in their lives as well. And you talked about healing. Well, we asked that, have you been healed from a physiological problem or a health problem? And 45% of the abductee group said yes, they had been healed. So these non-human entities are healing people as well.
And we've heard that from Reverend Michael Carter. You know him.
Yes, I do.
He was healed with the blood clot in his leg. He was healed from that. There in your abduction files, there's the passage about the like fetuses in the tanks.
Yes.
Betty and Barney didn't see anything like that.
And not everybody does see that. It depends upon the craft you're on.
And that was where I was going. You see episodes of the X-Files, with that's part of the one of the scenes in the show. You're dealing with people who reported that it's not appearing in Betty and Barney's discussions directly to you or in the hypnosis sessions. It is the are these tanks DNA storage units, whatever they're called?
Well, the information that I have on that from the numerous experiencers, almost 5,000 who took part in all of these studies combined, well, what we've discovered is that the non-human entities have said that there are several reasons for this. One, which benefits them, is that they had lost the ability to procreate and had to depend upon human DNA in order to do that. So it was for their benefit, but they said it was for our benefit as well. For our benefit, I already talked a little bit earlier about upgrading our DNA to make us kinder, gentler humans. And so there are those two things. Also, so many people have talked about observing hybrid children that they believe are their own children. They go onto the craft when they themselves are children and play games where they use their minds to do things such as floating a blue orb in the air from one child to another, that sort of thing on a craft. So they are upgrading us, and also I believe that they are collecting DNA from all over the world, not just human, but all the plants, all the flora and fauna, so that if we ever do destroy this planet, eventually they can reseed it. But I think that they might be terraforming other planets too, and putting everything from this planet onto those other planets. If you go back and think about the 1950s, there were a lot of these non-human entities outside their craft in farmers' fields, and there was a lot of talk about collecting soil samples. Well, they were also collecting plants from the field. So, it appears that there are many things that they are doing as part of their scientific program.
Yeah, and in the Abduction Files book, you talk about this gel type substance.
Yes.
Could that somehow be related to the that pink powder on Betty's dress? Like maybe something splashed on it, and we know she wasn't submerged, clothed in one of these tanks, but is with all the information that you've been gathering from abductees and eyewitnesses, could there be some connection there, or or are we talking about something totally different?
Well, I think that the only way that Betty could have gotten that gel on her dress was if she had been put into a travel pod, and they will put a human into that to protect them. They do it for themselves too, to protect their own bodies, and so the pod sort of forms over them. They lose consciousness, and from many of my cases, there has been gel on the clothing when the person's been taken out of that pod that quickly dissipates. Now, but they would have had to have taken Betty and Barney in that craft someplace else. So then you have to ask the question, do they have a base off the East Coast under the water? We know of so many reports of craft coming out of the water and entering the water again. If they had a base there and they didn't want to risk being caught, even though they were in a desolate area, they could have done that. Barney made a statement. Do they go underwater? I don't think I've ever mentioned that before in the book, but it makes me wonder now, because the more I know, the more I'm beginning to put pieces of the puzzle together in my mind. And at 2:14, when that craft came toward Pease Air Force Base from the east going west, could it have lifted up out of the ocean and traveled back to the place where they captured Betty and Barney to begin with? I mean, that's possible, but that's just fun speculation. It's impossible to have any scientific evidence regarding that. We'll never know the answer.
Okay. Okay. So we may never know the answer, like what you just said. What are some things we don't know right now, but with intrepid researchers like you, reports that come into you as well. What are some themes in ufology that we might be able to have a better understanding of what the ETs want from us or from the Earth?
Yes. Well, that is very, very interesting, and that is what I'm working on now, is communication. What those non-human entities are telling humans, and they say the same things over and over again to humans. And they started having a real interest in us back in the 1940s, and Major General John Samford, who was at the Pentagon in 1952, just made a statement after the craft were seen over Washington, D.C., and were on radar, and the military scrambled craft to chase these UFOs. Well, what Major General John Samford said at the largest press conference since the end of World War II was, "These things have been seen in our skies dating back to biblical times." He said they come back about once every century and then they go away. But in the 20th century, they came back again and they stayed this time. So he said that the Air Force was just studying this carefully. They weren't going to get excited or worried about it. They had never harmed humans before, but the Air Force was going to begin their study of all of this. So I have to give him a lot of credit for making that statement, because for me it goes down in history. This is a key, and he knew that information way back in 1952. And so I'm going off that and all of the research that I've done and what I've been able to obtain from the Air Force files and from even the skeptics files, and to try to put it all together in this gigantic puzzle to come up with the answers. And that's how I came up with this one answer that I have so much information for, and that is this genetic program to upgrade the human genome so that we will become kinder, gentler humans because of their fear that we will destroy this planet. And also not just through nuclear weapons, but since 1954, they have been communicating that we have not been good stewards to our environment, and it's extraordinarily important for us to take care of our planet. And if you go to my website at Kathleen-Marden.com, read an article. It's absolutely free. But read the article that I wrote on the CIA, the Navy, and Mrs. Swan. And it's a new article that I've just recently put up, but it's based upon a very interesting research study that I did where I was able to get the correspondence files of Admiral Knowles and Wilbert Smith, who was the Canadian government's UFO guy. And to put all of this information together, the government was very interested in communication way back in 1954. And that's communication with non-humans. So it's a fascinating study.
Yeah, and what I have enjoyed about your three books is that there is a pattern that you are detecting, with your observation skills, and like what you were saying, and 70 years ago, the statement was made about they've been here since biblical times. Well, you get Moses. Seemed like he was radiated after talking with God, and we've had Wallace Wagner as a guest, talking about some his readings of the what seems to be UFO documented cases in the Old New Testament. But there just seems to be a very long pattern of similar reports, and I think the surveys that the conclusions of the surveys you have in the alien abduction files is very revealing that this has been going on for a long time. Multi-generational. That's in your family as well. And it's a fascinating subject. And
I find it fascinating.
Yeah, and we're down to about the last couple minutes, unfortunately. If do you want to quickly give us, do you have any upcoming appearances? Hopefully that's going to be changing, soon.
I do.
Okay.
I absolutely do. And I'm going to be speaking at Roswell, and that's going to be over the July 4th weekend. And Exeter, New Hampshire is planning to have their conference again over Labor Day weekend. And then I'm going to be in northern Michigan at an experiencer conference in toward the end. I think it's the last weekend in September. But you can go to my website, and as I'm adding different speaking engagements, I'll put them on my website and give you the information about how to get in contact or find the website that is selling the tickets and gives you information about those conferences. I just received another invitation today. So people are beginning to decide to have live conferences again, and I cannot wait. I just love talking to the audience and people coming to the vendor table and discussing information with me. So I absolutely love it. I can't wait for it to happen again.
Okay. That's great. We're down to about a few seconds left, and I just wanted to thank you so much. It's been an honor to have you return to Nightlight, and we'll be glad to have you back. Just keep us posted. Next time you have something you want to talk about, let us know. We'll work you in quickly.
Okay. I'm working on a book now.